More than 200 lawmakers have now placed their names on a formal impeachment resolution aimed at Donald Trump, and this development is not being treated inside Washington as symbolic or performative. In fact, the speed alone has stunned even veteran congressional staffers. Less than 3 days after the document began circulating, nearly half of the House of Representatives had already signed on. That kind of momentum does not happen by accident, and it does not happen without something forcing the issue behind the scenes. This marks the third impeachment push connected to Trump in just over half a decade, but insiders insist this moment feels fundamentally different from what came before. According to multiple individuals familiar with internal deliberations, the driving force this time is not political messaging, not public pressure, and not partisan calculation. It is documentation, material that lawmakers reviewing it have reportedly described as detailed, internally consistent, and deeply troubling. The kind of material that changes behavior quickly. Several members of the House Judiciary Committee have privately acknowledged that once the documents were reviewed, hesitation evaporated. Lawmakers who had resisted previous efforts did not ask how this would play on television or how voters might respond. Instead, the question became whether failing to act would itself represent a breach of duty. That shift alone explains the speed with which signatures accumulated. The catalyst, according to congressional sources, was a classified intelligence briefing delivered in mid-January. That briefing allegedly outlined evidence suggesting coordination between senior administration figures and foreign financial interests at moments when federal investigations were actively underway. The concern raised was not merely foreign contact, but timing. Communications, financial movements, and enforcement decisions reportedly appeared to intersect in ways that could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Committees reviewing the material were said to have examined records indicating contact between U.S. officials and overseas banking entities during periods when the Department of Justice was handling sensitive enforcement actions. These records, according to people familiar with the review, included transaction logs, internal messages, and compliance flags generated by career analysts. The implication presented was that financial relationships may have influenced the pace or direction of federal scrutiny. Constitutional scholars briefed by lawmakers have reportedly warned that, if substantiated, the conduct described would strike at the heart of the presidential oath, not because of policy disagreements or executive overreach in the abstract, but because the allegations center on potential obstruction of law enforcement for personal or political benefit. Comparisons to Watergate have surfaced repeatedly, not due to superficial similarities, but because of the alleged use of power to interfere with investigations rather than confront them. What has shaken Washington most is that support for the resolution did not break neatly along party lines. When members of the president's own party, including committee leadership, chose to sign on, it signaled that loyalty had encountered a limit. These are not marginal figures. Several of them defended Trump during earlier controversies, publicly dismissed past impeachment efforts, and criticized what they viewed as partisan overreach. Their reversal has been interpreted internally as evidence that the material presented crossed a threshold that political alignment could no longer justify ignoring. To understand how this reached such a flashpoint, it's important to look at what had been building in the months leading up to January. Tensions between Congress and the executive branch had already been elevated by disputes over executive authority, stalled confirmations, and repeated clashes over oversight access. Quiet concerns about foreign financial exposure had circulated among career investigators as early as the fall, but those concerns remained largely internal until something changed. That change reportedly came when a whistleblower from within the Treasury Department approached congressional investigators with an extensive package of documents. Hundreds of pages in length, the material allegedly included transaction histories, internal correspondence, and records showing how certain enforcement actions were paused or delayed. According to multiple sources, the whistleblower had attempted to raise concerns through internal channels months earlier and was advised to disengage. Lawmakers reviewing the records have said the most alarming aspect was not any single transaction, but the pattern that emerged when viewed as a whole. Enforcement actions appeared to stall shortly after significant financial movements involving entities connected to administration allies. In multiple instances, Investigations that had been progressing were suddenly placed on hold without clear written justification. To those examining the data, the sequence itself told the story. The seriousness of these concerns led to an emergency session of the House Judiciary Committee, convened in a secure location beneath the Capitol. Members arrived expecting a technical briefing. What they encountered instead, according to several accounts, was testimony that altered the tone of the entire inquiry. Even lawmakers accustomed to classified material reportedly struggled to conceal their reaction. One Republican committee chairman, long considered a reliable defender of the president, emerged from the session visibly shaken. Witnesses described him as uncharacteristically silent, bypassing reporters and retreating directly to his office. By the end of the evening, his name appeared on the impeachment resolution. For many inside Congress, that moment marked the point of no return. The most consequential testimony that day came from a senior Treasury official who was questioned directly about the transaction records and the enforcement pauses. According to individuals present, she confirmed that career analysts had flagged the financial patterns months earlier. She also confirmed that formal reporting was halted after instructions came down from higher levels. When pressed on who issued those instructions, she declined to answer, citing national security constraints and classified communications. That refusal set off immediate alarm. Members demanded clarification, pointing out that obstruction of justice cannot simply be shielded by classification. When asked whether executive privilege was being invoked, the official reportedly said no, explaining instead that she had been advised that discussing the chain of command would risk exposing protected sources and methods. The room, according to those present, went completely still. A senior Republican member then asked a question that reframed the entire issue. Was the committee being told that interference with federal investigations had been classified as a national security matter? Was the machinery designed to protect intelligence being used to prevent oversight? The official did not contradict the premise. She stated only that the decisions had been made above her level and that she was deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Those remarks were reportedly leaked within hours, triggering frantic discussions across Capitol Hill. The language used by lawmakers afterward was strikingly blunt. One member was overheard describing the situation as obstruction concealed behind classification protocols. Another reportedly said the comparison to Nixon was unavoidable, not because of the original conduct, but because of the effort to contain exposure. As this information spread among House members, the pace of signatures accelerated dramatically. Lawmakers who had remained undecided requested immediate access to the materials. Many emerged from review sessions having already made up their minds. By the time the resolution became public, its support was already broad enough to force leadership to confront a reality they had hoped to avoid. This is the moment the story shifts from speculation to consequence. What began as internal concern has now become a formal constitutional process. The question is no longer whether impeachment should be discussed, but how far the evidence will carry it. And this is only the beginning. Once the resolution went public, the reaction inside Washington shifted from shock to recalculation. This was no longer a theoretical exercise or a quiet internal dispute. It had crossed into open constitutional conflict. Lawmakers who had assumed party loyalty would hold indefinitely were suddenly forced to reassess that assumption. Offices that had spent years defending the president began quietly preparing contingency plans. What made this moment especially destabilizing was the nature of the evidence being discussed. People familiar with the materials stressed that this was not built on anonymous accusations or secondhand testimony. It was built on records, bank documents with timestamps, internal emails routed through official systems, compliance alerts generated automatically by financial institutions, not by political actors. These are the kinds of records that do not care about ideology or allegiance. Legal analysts began pointing out that previous impeachment efforts had centered largely on intent and interpretation. This one, they said, centers on sequence, a sequence of financial movements followed by enforcement pauses, a sequence of communications followed by classification decisions, a sequence of warnings followed by silence. When patterns repeat often enough, coincidence becomes an increasingly difficult defense. Behind closed doors, several Republican lawmakers reportedly acknowledged that the material placed them in an impossible position. Supporting the president now meant explaining away evidence that was produced by career officials and private institutions. Opposing the process meant defending conduct that, if proven, would undermine the basic premise of executive accountability. For some, the calculation became less about politics and more about legacy. The Justice Department has not publicly commented on the allegations, but multiple former prosecutors have weighed in, noting that obstruction cases rarely hinge on a single act. They are built on cumulative behavior, delays that cannot be justified, directives that lack written authorization, classifications that appear inconsistent with established protocol. Each piece alone may be defensible. Together they form a narrative. This is where the issue of classification has taken center stage. Classification authority exists to protect national security, not to shield officials from scrutiny. When lawmakers hear that potential interference with investigations has been wrapped in secrecy, alarm bells ring immediately. Oversight cannot function if the executive branch alone decides which of its actions may be examined. Several intelligence and legal professionals have described this dynamic as one of the most dangerous stress tests the system can face. If classification becomes a tool for concealment rather than protection, the balance of power collapses. Congress loses its ability to check misconduct. Courts are left blind. The public is excluded entirely. Public reaction has followed familiar partisan lines, but even there, cracks are appearing. Polling conducted after the resolution's introduction shows a sharp increase in support for at least holding impeachment hearings, including among independents and a noticeable minority of Republican voters. The shift appears tied not to rhetoric, but to the repeated emphasis on documentation. Media coverage has also evolved. Early reporting focused on the headline number of signatures. As more details leaked, coverage became more technical and less ideological. Financial analysts began discussing market implications. Constitutional scholars debated precedents. Former officials spoke cautiously, often emphasizing process over outcome. One of the most striking developments has been the response from individuals who previously defended expansive presidential authority. Several conservative legal commentators have now acknowledged that if a president used executive power to interfere with investigations into personal financial matters, impeachment would be precisely the remedy envisioned by the Constitution. That admission alone has widened the coalition taking this effort seriously. Markets reacted almost immediately. While volatility is not unusual during political upheaval, analysts noted that international investors appeared particularly sensitive to the story. Questions about the reliability of American institutions tend to ripple outward, affecting confidence far beyond Washington. Financial stability depends as much on trust in governance as on economic fundamentals. Inside federal agencies, the mood has reportedly shifted towards self-preservation. Career officials are documenting interactions meticulously. Emails are being archived. Meetings are being summarized in writing. Some employees have quietly sought legal counsel to better understand their obligations if called to testify. This behavior is not driven by panic, but by experience. When oversight intensifies, records become everything. The White House response has followed a familiar pattern. Public statements have dismissed the resolution as partisan and illegitimate. Allies have framed the allegations as a continuation of long-running opposition efforts. Names of lawmakers who signed on have been circulated to supportive media outlets, often accompanied by threats of primary challenges. The goal appears to be deterrence through intimidation. Yet this strategy carries significant risk. Attacking the credibility of lawmakers is one thing. Attacking the credibility of one's own appointees and long-serving civil servants is another. When a defense requires discrediting institutions that the administration itself oversees, the argument begins to collapse under its own weight. Former prosecutors have pointed out another problem with the dismissal strategy. If the documents are fabricated, why classify anything related to them? If the conduct is innocent, why instruct officials not to answer basic questions about who made key decisions? The logic strains under scrutiny, and each unanswered question invites another. This is why so many observers believe the next phase will be decisive. Public hearings will force testimony into the open. Documents will be entered into the record. Assertions made behind closed doors will face challenge. Once that process begins, controlling the narrative becomes nearly impossible. Several administration officials have already been subpoenaed. Some are expected to comply, others may refuse, citing executive privilege. That choice alone could escalate the situation rapidly, triggering court battles that would drag the judiciary directly into the conflict. Judges are often reluctant participants in political disputes, but classification and obstruction claims leave them little room to avoid involvement. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore. In previous crises, the turning point did not come when allegations surfaced, but when institutions asserted themselves, when courts demanded compliance, when party leaders decided that defending misconduct posed a greater risk than confronting it. Whether that moment has arrived here remains uncertain, but the conditions are forming. What makes this case particularly volatile is that it does not hinge on public opinion alone. It hinges on whether evidence holds under oath, whether documents withstand forensic review, whether officials maintain consistent accounts. These are tests that cannot be spun away indefinitely. As one former judge put it privately, systems are built for moments like this, but they are not built to make anyone comfortable. Accountability is disruptive by design. It forces clarity where ambiguity has been convenient. It demands answers where silence has been protective. The impeachment resolution has now set that machinery in motion. Committees are preparing schedules. Staff are drafting questions. Legal teams are mapping strategies. And every participant understands that once testimony begins, there's no way to rewind the process. This is the phase where consequences start to crystallize. Not verdicts yet, but direction, momentum, commitment. The question facing Washington now is not whether this will be contentious. It already is. The question is whether the institutions tasked with enforcing limits still have the resolve to do so. And that question will be answered very soon. As the process advances, the reality setting in across Washington is that there is no clean exit from this moment. Once impeachment machinery is activated at this scale, it does not simply dissolve under pressure or distraction. It forces decisions. It forces testimony. It forces lines to be drawn publicly rather than whispered behind closed doors. For many officials involved, the most unsettling aspect is not the political fallout, but the loss of control. Senior members of Congress have quietly acknowledged that this phase feels different from anything they have experienced. Not louder, not more chaotic, but more procedural. The noise of outrage is being replaced by the slow grind of documentation, subpoenas, and sworn statements. That shift favors institutions, not personalities. It favors records over rhetoric. The House Judiciary Committee has begun mapping out public hearings, and staff are reportedly preparing to release carefully redacted materials to establish a factual baseline before testimony begins. The goal, according to aides familiar with the planning, is to anchor the discussion and evidence early before competing narratives harden. Once witnesses are under oath, inconsistencies become difficult to explain away. What has heightened anxiety within the administration is the growing sense that this inquiry is no longer confined to Congress. Inspectors general, compliance officers, and independent auditors are now reviewing the same transaction patterns. Each review operates under a different mandate, but they intersect at the same facts. Parallel scrutiny increases risk because it reduces the possibility that a single legal strategy can contain exposure. Former federal judges have noted that when multiple oversight mechanisms activate simultaneously, the pressure becomes cumulative. Even if one avenue stalls, others continue. Delays in Congress do not stop inspectors general. Classification disputes do not halt financial audits. Courts may eventually be asked to resolve conflicts between secrecy claims and oversight authority, and those rulings tend to have lasting consequences. Inside the Republican Party, the internal debate has intensified. Leadership figures are reportedly split between those who believe aggressive defense remains the only viable option and those who fear that continued denial will permanently damage institutional credibility. Several lawmakers who have not yet taken a public position are said to be waiting for the first hearing before deciding where they stand. That hesitation itself reflects uncertainty that did not exist weeks ago. What complicates the political calculus is the composition of the impeachment coalition. It is not driven solely by ideological opponents. It includes lawmakers with conservative credentials, long voting records, aligned with the president, and deep ties to party leadership. Their participation signals to others that this is not merely a test of loyalty, but a test of judgment. Outside Washington, attention is turned to the potential consequences beyond removal from office. Legal analysts have emphasized that impeachment is not a criminal process, but it can expose facts that trigger further action. Financial records disclosed during hearings could prompt referrals. Testimony could open new lines of inquiry. Even if impeachment ultimately fails in the Senate, the record created may have independent effects. This reality has reportedly led to heightened concern among individuals who may be called as witnesses. Some are said to be reviewing prior statements carefully. Others are seeking guidance on how to navigate questions involving classification without appearing evasive. The margin for error narrows significantly under oath, especially when documents exist to contradict recollections. The issue of national security continues to loom over the proceedings. Intelligence professionals have warned that misuse of classification erodes trust internally as well as externally. Allies watch how oversight functions. If secrecy appears to shield misconduct, confidence in shared intelligence arrangements weakens. That damage is difficult to quantify and even harder to reverse. Former officials across administrations have spoken cautiously but consistently about this risk. They stress that classification is a tool, not a defense. It is meant to protect legitimate secrets, not to resolve political embarrassment. When those boundaries blur, the system itself becomes vulnerable. Public sentiment remains fluid. While core supporters remain steadfast, broader audiences appear increasingly focused on process rather than personality. Surveys show that many Americans are less interested in partisan framing and more concerned with whether rules were followed and whether institutions are functioning as designed. That shift may prove decisive in sustaining momentum. The president's public response has continued to emphasize defiance, portraying the effort as illegitimate and politically motivated. Allies echo that language, warning of retaliation and instability. But behind the scenes, even sympathetic advisors are said to be urging caution, aware that confrontational rhetoric can harden opposition and complicate legal strategy. One former White House counsel described the situation succinctly: investigations thrive on resistance. The more aggressively witnesses are blocked, the more aggressively courts tend to intervene. History suggests that cooperation, however painful, often limits damage more effectively than blanket refusal. As hearings approach, the focus will turn to a small number of pivotal questions. Who authorized enforcement pauses? Why were certain findings not documented? How were classification decisions made? And by whom? These are not abstract issues. They are concrete, answerable questions, and each answer will either narrow or widen the scope of the inquiry. What makes this moment uniquely consequential is that it tests not only one presidency, but the durability of norms that have long been assumed rather than enforced. Norms function only when participants respect them. When they fail, systems must decide whether to adapt or erode. Several lawmakers have remarked privately that they are less concerned with immediate outcomes than with precedent. If this conduct is tolerated, what message does that send to future office holders? If it is confronted, what risks does that entail? These are not comfortable questions, but they are unavoidable. The coming weeks will provide clarity. Hearings will reveal whether the evidence holds up under scrutiny. Courts may be asked to arbitrate disputes over access and privilege. Political alliances will be tested publicly rather than rhetorically, and the country will witness in real time whether accountability mechanisms still operate when stakes are highest. There is no guarantee of resolution that satisfies all sides. There rarely is. But there is a guarantee that this process will leave a record of who acted, who hesitated, and who chose to look away. History tends to be unforgiving in its assessment of such moments. This is where matters stand now. The resolution has been filed. The evidence is being examined. Witnesses are being summoned. And the question that hangs over everything is simple, even if the answer is not. When power and law collide, which one yields? That answer will shape far more than a single presidency. It will shape the boundaries of authority for generations to come.